All right, Phil, let's do this. So, I don't know how many of you, if any of you, signed up to take this class because you thought you basically just spend your entire time watching movies and not really doing a whole lot. If that is why you signed up for it, you guessed wrong. As the title of this PowerPoint implies, Orwell's Rules for Academic Writing, y'all gonna write. You are going to write a few essays for me over the course of this semester. And while I'm waiting to hear back from you from this survey, which I cannot emphasize enough, the need to get that survey turned in, that is going to help me so much plan how we're going to try and make this class work virtually. But while we're waiting for that survey, I want to go over just some general rules and advice for academic writing, things that I expect and things that will improve your writing, not just in this class, but in any class where you have to write a formal academic essay. So, to start with, Orwell's Rules of Academic Writing. They are so called because they come from this guy, George Orwell, who was an author of both fiction and nonfiction. He was a journalist. He wrote a lot in a variety of genres, again, ranging from novels to articles for newspapers. Again, he was a war correspondent during the Spanish-American War and wrote for newspapers, just describing what was going on there. He's also written political essays, and he's also just written general kind of like journal entries. So the guy wrote a lot, and he knows what he's talking about, or knew what he's talking about when it comes to writing. And Orwell, okay, you can kind of make that out. This will be on Canvas, by the way, but anyway. Orwell had a number of rules, really more so guidelines and suggestions to follow, just to make your academic writing interesting and clear to read, while also properly conveying your point and being formal and professional and blah, blah, blah. So, when you're writing, and this kind of goes with anything, not just even academic writing, but when you're writing, there are 6 questions you should ask yourself. 6 questions that you need to be able to answer before you write anything. When you're writing, you need to understand, you need to know, what am I trying to say? You need to know what point you're trying to make. Going from there, you need to think what words will express it. What is the best, clearest way for me to explain the point I'm trying to make? 3, what image or idiom will make it clearer? Are there specific examples or figures of speech or metaphors, similes, figurative language that I can use to try and clarify my point or to amplify my writing and make it more impactful? And that kind of goes along with question 4, is this image fresh enough to have an effect? If I include some figurative language, or if I try to include an example, is it going to land? Is it a good enough example that it actually works and fits the explanation, while also is it interesting enough to grab the reader's attention and engage them? If it's not really going to grab the reader's attention, it kind of defeats the purpose of trying to include figurative language, because we're just going to zone it out. This goes to basically figures of speech that are used over and over and over again. Stuff like, it's raining cats and dogs outside. Stuff like that. Question 5, could I put it more shortly? This is something that I struggle with as a writer myself. People get tired of reading long passages, especially when you're reading it and you get the sense that this paragraph could be summed up in like 2 sentences. Instead of 5, it could be 2 sentences. They're just padding stuff on to make it longer. Again, this was my problem. One of my literature professors in college ripped me apart on the first paper I turned in because my sentences were too long. So, if you can put it more shortly, if you can simplify it, do it. Your reader will appreciate it because you're getting more to the point. You're not elaborating overly on stuff, which I think I'm doing right now. Okay, question 6. Have I said anything that is avoidably ugly? Basically, is my wording clear enough and effective enough to make this work? Or is my wording just awkward and bad, and is it just going to turn the reader off? I think we've all read stuff before. I know I have. Reading things that you don't even finish or you don't want to finish because they're just so poorly written. It doesn't matter what they're trying to say because you just can't get past the bad writing. So these are the questions you need to have in mind when you're writing, just to clarify your writing, to help make it easier to understand while you're doing it, and while you're writing, and while you're reviewing your writing. And that's an important term to get in the habit, an important habit to get used to. Reviewing and revising your writing. There's a common saying that all good writing is rewriting. And yes, I hate it too. It's annoying, but I mean, it's true. Okay, so these are his rules. There are 6 of them. These are the first 3. Rule 1, never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech you are used to seeing in print. This goes back to when he posits the question, is the language I'm using fresh enough to have an impact? If it's not fresh enough, if this is some figurative language that's overused, don't use it because it's not going to draw your reader in like a really good use of figurative language would. And you don't have to use figurative language in your writing. When done properly, it really amplifies it. When done badly, it's just, yeah. Rule number 2, never use a long word where a short one will do. So with this is where it's important to know your audience. Who are you writing for? And it's important to tailor the language you use to your audience. So, for example, there's this fairly common knowledge. I cannot talk right now. There's this bit of common knowledge that is kind of true, kind of not, that most newspaper articles are written for an 8th grade, with an 8th grade vocabulary. And they do that because they're trying to reach the broadest possible audience. Basically, they want to have their vocabulary broad enough so they can express their fairly complicated points, but they also want to keep it limited enough so that way they can appeal to a broader range of readers. So and this will vary depending on your audience, but you want to use relatively simple and clear language to describe whatever it is you're writing about, to convey your point. Because the simpler the language you use, the more likely it is that your audience is going to understand it. Now, if you're writing for a more educated audience, so for example, if you were writing for like a scholarly journal, you're going to be using, as Orwell describes, long words. You're going to be using complicated vocabulary and language because your audience will understand it, and that's the type of periodical, I guess, that you're writing for. So simplify as much as possible. Don't use overly big words that you're kind of sure you know the meaning of, but not really. But you're using them to try and sound smart, because when those words are not necessary and when they're used in that way, it's so obvious to tell. Actually, that same literature professor that ripped me apart for having long sentences, told a story where her advisor for her PhD ripped her apart, where he was basically making the argument that he left her a note or something like, in this paragraph, you're not really saying anything, you're just using a bunch of really big, sophisticated words to make yourself sound smart. It's really obvious when you're using big words to just sound smart, so just don't do it. Okay. Rule number 3, if it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. Again, you don't want to make your writing overly long. And this is where I generally get asked in person about my expectations for length of writing in this class. And my answer is always, I would rather have 3 pages of good than 6 pages of meh. What I mean is, I'd rather have 3 solid trim pages of content than 6 pages that really only have 3 pages worth of content and 3 pages worth of fluff and bullcrap that you're just putting in there to reach a page limit. So I don't really expect lengthy writings from you, but I expect good quality writing from you. Okay. Last 3 rules. Rule number 4, never use the passive where you can use the active. This one, when I was learning when I was in senior comp and being graded on using active voice over passive voice, was so annoying. So when we're saying use active voice over passive voice, what that means is you want to use what we call action verbs over passive verbs, or being verbs, or to be verbs. Examples of to be verbs that you should be avoided are is, was, are. These are verbs that, while they'll fit, are just kind of boring. It's much more interesting to read an action verb. So for example, if I was going to use like a passive, like a sentence with a passive verb, it would be something like, he is skiing. Whereas it's much more interesting if I use the active form of that sentence, which would be, he skis. It's more interesting, it's more engaging to the reader, and it will also help you trim down on length and keep your papers trim and not padded. I'm not going to emphasize this too much because this is really hard to get in the habit of. Once you get in the habit of doing this, it's pretty easy, but it's so annoying to get yourself in the habit of that. Okay. Rule number 5, never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. Again, you don't want to be overly sophisticated. You want your points to be expressed as clearly as possible, because the more you try and use these jargon words or these bigger words that you're less likely to understand the meaning of, the more likely you are to misuse them. And especially if you're writing for someone who is familiar with this stuff, it's going to stand out that you really don't know what you're talking about. Simple is always better. The simpler you can make it, the more likely it is that your reader's going to get what point you're trying to make, and the better your writing is going to be. Lastly, break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. So, if you follow all these rules, and you read through it, and you're like, this just is not good. It's just, yes, I'm following the rules, but it's just awkward and meh and just bad. Then make it good. Make it sound better. These are not hard and fast rules. These are, again, just recommendations or guidelines or bits of advice to help you and help make you better academic writers. Now, these are not necessarily what I'm grading you on, but these will make it easier for you to express the points that I'm going to be grading your essays on. Okay? And lastly, this, for me, this is so true. Every time I have to write something for every time I've written something for a class previously, every time I have to write something for a class now, I always think it's terrible. And it's normal to think you're bad. It's normal to think you're a bad writer. It does not necessarily mean it is. Again, I can't talk to it. It does not necessarily mean you are. It's probably fine. Relax. If you have any questions about anything, send me an email. Stop by my office hours. Again, get that survey done so I can get planning for basically how we're going to watch movies while we're going virtual. And I'll talk to you tomorrow.